I had the opportunity last week to go and visit the Nova exhibit here in Los Angeles, and I know some people, Lori and Jerry, were there. Raise your hand if you've already been there. I, Thank you so much for going. And if you haven't had a chance, we're going to be going as a congregation. We have two opportunities coming up in September. And so just pay attention to your Eyes on Wise and our website, and you can come with the group. We have a block of tickets. Very, very powerful experience, and something that I think everyone should go to. And really, more importantly, please bring a friend, especially a friend who's not Jewish and who might not have been. The algorithm is interesting because everybody's feed's not the same, you know that. And if you are interested in Israel, if you're interested in Jewish things, your feed is just filled with this. And everyone knows what the Nova Festival was, everyone knows about the Nova exhibit. It's a very powerful and present part of your life. But you might have a different algorithm, and you just might not know what's happened. You might not be aware of it. So I think it's very, very important that you go. When we went last week, we were accompanied by a reporter from NPR, and they did what I thought was a really beautiful segment that really captured the experience. And two of our congregants, one 17-year-old who just graduated our school, Eliana Svilik, was interviewed along with her mother, Dr. Maria Svilik. So highly recommend that. So the text I'm going to teach, I think, actually relates to the Nova exhibit, and I wanted to start by sharing something that happened when we went to visit the actual site. The Nova exhibit here includes artifacts from the music festival, and it's quite powerful and chilling to realize that everything you see, the tents, the porta potties, the sandals, everything was actually from the festival itself. And it was brought first to Tel Aviv, where they did the exhibit, then to New York, and then now to Los Angeles. And when we visited, it was extraordinary. It was a beautiful day. We were there in February, right after Tu B'Shvat, and they had planted for every one of the people who was killed that day a beautiful tree. And one thing that Jacqueline said to me when we were walking around is she said, it feels like we're in the killing fields. It feels like we're in one of those places. And we realized we were, which was incredibly disturbing to be in Israel and to experience that. And we walked around, and then you walked to where the actual festival was, sort of the center of it. There were not that many people there that day, a little more than 3,000. And what they've created there is there are posts, and on each post is the face of one of the people who was killed that day. And then there are some posts that have pictures of people who were kidnapped from the Nova Festival and are now in Gaza, like our friend Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. And we had an opportunity to spend about 20 minutes just walking around, seeing the faces. Sometimes there was descriptions of their lives. And then we walked to a place where there were all of these yahrzeit candles where you could light. And we said Kaddish. And I'm not making this up, Emes, at the very end of Kaddish, Osei Shalom B'Romav, Amen, the siren went off. And at that part of Israel, you're so close to the Gaza border that there's no chance for Iron Dome to shoot a missile down. If the siren goes off, you run to the shelter. And we did. All of us, our whole group, and everybody else who was visiting at that same time, we ran as fast as we could. And actually, one of the people on the trip with us was filming us saying Kaddish. And so she ended up catching the whole thing on film, and it was really horrifying to see it after the fact. We ran into this little, what's called a migonit, which is a little bomb shelter that's a freestanding bomb shelter. We ran inside the bomb shelter. We crammed ourselves in there, and you wait a minute or two. You get the all clear, thank goodness. Everybody was fine, and we came back out. What does that have to do? You know what that has to do with the Nova exhibit and the Nova Festival. But what does that have to do with this week's Torah portion? Well, as I was quickly scrambling to try to find something to teach when I found out that Josh was sick, I came to this verse, which is one of the most powerful verses in Parashat Ekev. And Raz is going to put it up on the screen for those of you joining from home. And those of you who are here on the way in, you might have gotten this little half sheet. And if not, we have some more in the back over by where our security officer, Donnie, is. But you can grab one or share with your friend next to you. It's just 2 verses, but it's very powerful. Right in the middle of our parashah, Ve'ata Yisrael ma Adonai Elohecha shoel me'imach. And if you know the book of Micah, it'll sound very familiar. The good news is Micah knew the book of Deuteronomy. So he is really kind of referencing and quoting Deuteronomy here. But it says, and now Israel, and now I'm going to tell you, Jewish people, what it is that the eternal your God requires of you. And then it uses this phrase, ki'im, which means, it's an idiom in Hebrew. It means only this. This is all God requires of you. And then you want to pay attention, because what's going to follow is going to be pretty important. This is what God demands of us. And what does it say? To revere your God. I'm going to get back to that part because that's the part I want to focus on. To walk in God's divine paths, to love and to serve your eternal God with all your heart and soul, keeping Adonai's commandments and laws, which I enjoin upon you today. And then the last part's so powerful, for your good. The things that God is asking us in these verses in Deuteronomy, it says, L'tov lecha. It's good, it'll be good for you to do these things. But it starts with yirah. What is it that God asks of you? Ki im leyirah et Adonai Elohecha. And then there are those other parts that follow walking in God's paths. But it starts with yirah. And what is yirah? It can mean to fear God. It can mean to be in awe of God, to revere God. But there is that sense of fear. Not really like pachad, the mortal fear that you experience when a siren goes off and you think, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to me? But I always think of yirah as, maybe you've had this experience, when you're in the ocean and you're swimming and you realize that you can't see to the bottom. And you don't know, is it 100 meters down? Is it 5 meters down? Is there a shark below me? I get a little scared when I think, and it's not that mortal fear. It's just the fear of how vast it is. Or maybe it's the yirah that you've experienced when you look up into the heavens at night, especially if you're outside of the city and you can see the billions and billions and billions of stars out there, and you just think, wow, I'm so small. That's a sense of yirah. So what is the purpose of starting this verse with fear? What is it that God commands of you? Only this, fear God. And again, I know it continues with some other pieces, but I just want to focus on the fear. Fear God. Why? Commentators throughout the centuries have, of course, focused on that. Why start with fear? That seems like a strange place. And I just want to share one of them, because there's many that we could look at, but I just want to share one. And in the few minutes I had to pull this together, I was reading about the sage who teaches this little text. His name is Rabbi Yosef Albo, and he's one of the great commentators of the Middle Ages. He lived in Spain. They think he was born in Aragon. There's actually a lot about him we don't know. But he lived in the 15th century. He was born in the late 1300s and lived into the 1400s. He died in about 1440. And one of the things he went through in his own lifetime was a disputation. And some of you might know about these disputations that happened during the Middle Ages. And if you've been to Barcelona, you can actually go to the great cathedral there. I think we were there together. And you can see the place where there was the famous disputation of Barcelona with Nachmanides. What would happen at the disputation? The Gentile king, who was almost always in those settings Catholic at that time, would stage a debate between a cardinal or a bishop, someone high up in the church, and a rabbi. And it was theater. It was meant to ultimately decide what was better, Christianity or Judaism. But the rabbi had to play along. There's actually some great jokes about some of these disputations. I'm not going to go into those tonight. But there's this famous disputation that Rabbi Yosef Albo was required to participate in. It wasn't the kind of thing that you'd say, I think I'll sit this one out. When the king or whatever feudal lord said, Rabbi Stern, get up here and debate, you had to do it. You knew you were going to lose. You had to do it respectfully, or you might get beheaded or burned at the stake or something like that. So I thought that was interesting that this person who's going to teach us this little thing about fear experienced that in his life, and I'm sure much, much worse. He died before the expulsion, but he lived in the century where the expulsion happened. And so you can imagine the kinds of things that built up to it. You could imagine the anti-Semitism that he experienced in his daily life, yet without any hope for being able to really influence the powers that be. You think about the influence that we have in the United States today, notwithstanding the challenges, notwithstanding the anti-Semitism that is concerning us, we are in a very, very different position than Yosef Albo was. And on top of that, notwithstanding the challenges we find ourselves in, we live in a moment where there's a sovereign Jewish state that has an army, that has power, that can advocate for itself. However difficult the moment we are in, we know that it's not anything like the moment Yosef Albo was in. So I'm especially taken by the fact that he focuses on fear. And he says that, of course, we naturally are going to have a sense of, he thought it would be natural to have a sense of yirat hashamayim, a fear of heaven, because we are so in awe of the world in which we find ourselves. But the problem is our ego gets in the way, and we start to think that all the good things that happen around the world, that's part of the reason I focused at Ma'ariv Aravim on creation, we start to think that all the good things that happen in the world are because we're so great. As opposed to maybe we just got lucky, maybe we got a gift from someone else. It might have just been something that came our way that we have no reason to deserve. So that's one of the reasons that Yirat Hashamayim is so important, because it can help and remind us not to be arrogant and not to think that it all came from our own hands. But then he points out that there are two exemplars of fear of heaven. And one exemplar is Abraham. And he says, Rabbi Yosef Albo, that according to our Torah, Avraham is not described as someone who has Yirat Hashamayim, a fear of heaven, until after he was repeatedly tested by God. And so according to Rabbi Yosef Albo, Abraham learned to be in awe of God, to tremble before God through the difficult things that he went through in his life, the humility that he gained by getting knocked on his tush again and again and again, and he realized, wow, I'm not in control of everything. I'm not the master of the universe. There's a power bigger than me. So that's one example of how you can develop Yirat Hashamayim. You experience terrible misfortune and setbacks. That's not so inspiring. It might strike you as the way the world is. It might strike you as truthful, but it might not lift your soul. But there's another example Rabbi Yosef Albo teaches us. He says there's another way you can develop Yirat Hashamayim. You don't have to get knocked on your tush. There's another way. And that way is found in the verse. So if you go back to the rest of the verse, he says another way you can learn what Yirat Hashamayim is lalechet b'chol derachav. If you just try to follow God's paths, what does that mean? That means to emulate God. God was compassionate. God is compassionate. You be compassionate. God is forgiving, not endlessly forgiving, but very, very forgiving. You should be just that. God is kind and gracious. You should be that. So when you walk in God's ways, you can develop that sense of awe and reverence. And then what does it say? Ula ahava oto. When you love God, and our tradition teaches us we love God by loving other people, that's a way to develop Yirat Hashamayim. And when you la'avod et Adonai, that's what we're doing tonight. We worship God, we thank God, we praise God through prayer. That's another way that we develop Yirat Hashamayim. So what I love about that is he says, okay, there's the way of getting knocked down, and that will teach you to revere God. But the other way is a very proactive way that you can experience in your own life. You consciously decide to love God, to walk in God's ways, to emulate God. And the more you do that, the more awe that you experience, and the more that becomes a part of who you are. So now let me conclude by just going back to that moment, running for that shelter. One of the most beautiful parts of that was to watch this group. Some of us had known each other for quite some time, like Jacqueline and me, for example. We were on the group together, and there were other married couples who were on the group, but there were others who had just met each other on this trip. We'd only been together for a few days. And one thing that was so beautiful as we were running in mortal fear to this migonit, everyone was looking to grab the other person, or do we have everyone? And even when we got inside the shelter, people, you could see on this video that I mentioned to you, people were asking, did Jeff make it in? No one asked about me, by the way. That was a little strange. I saw that on the video afterwards. But people wanted to know, is everyone there? And so even in that moment of fear, we were trying to walk in God's way, naturally, to take care of each other and to love each other. The kind of heart opening that you experience when you go to something like the Nova exhibit and you imagine what would it be like. One of the things that Eliana Svilik said on NPR is she said, I could relate really to those phone calls that some of the survivors and people who didn't survive recorded on their phones, calling their parents or leaving a video for their parents. She said, I could relate to that because that's what I would have done. So there's a heart opening there too. So these two different ways to come to know God, maybe it's through misfortune and being knocked on your tush and having setbacks in life and the humility that comes with that. But then this other way, by proactively and actively choosing to try to walk in God's ways and to emulate God and to be like God in everything we do. I want to really encourage everybody here to make it to the Nova exhibit. Come with us again. Keep your eyes open for the publicity that'll tell you how to register. And I think that's probably going out next week, how to register to come with us. And you'll probably, if you've been, then you'll probably think, I want to encourage my friends to go, and maybe I'll invite someone who's not Jewish to come along with me.